Good evening. In the series Deep Talk, Critical Conflicts, we discuss global events that should be news headlines, but are crowded out by news closer to home. Today, we discuss the civil war in Yemen. This complex war started in 2014. Houthi militants overthrew the government in Sana'a, Yemen's capital. With support from Iran, the Houthis now control the north of Yemen. In response, a pro-government coalition, led by Saudi Arabia, actively bomb areas under Houthi control. In the meantime, anti-Houthi forces in the south also fight each other. Civilians pay the price. Over 200,000 people have been killed, and over 13 million Yemeni civilians face starvation. Why has this brutal conflict been going on for all these years? We will discuss it today with Human Rights Officer for Amnesty International, Floor Beuming, and Senior Researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies, Abdulghani Al-Iryani. My name is Parveen Mirahimi. Welcome at the Bali. Welcome both to this talk here in the studio, Floor Beuming, and in Yemen, Sana'a, Abdulghani Al-Iryani. Floor Beuming, you work for Amnesty International in the Netherlands as a senior officer human rights programs, specifically in the regions Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Qatar. After finishing your study Arabic language and culture, you worked for 4 years for the Democratic Institute in Yemen. Welcome. And in Sana'a, Abdulghani Al-Iryani, you are a senior researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies, where you focus on the peace process, conflict analysis, and transformations of the Yemeni state. Prior to joining the Sana'a Center, you worked with the United Nations as well as the World Bank on issues related to the conflict in Yemen. And you are also a correspondent and political analyst for various television stations around the world. Welcome to you both. To start with you, Mr. Al-Iryani, you are currently in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. How would you describe the situation there at the moment?
I've been going back and forth, visiting Sana'a yearly since the beginning of the war. And what I see is that I see two distinct features. One is the city is getting adapted to a new normal, where there are basic services such as water and electricity. The people are going back to work somewhat. But on the other hand, water and electricity is very expensive, and 80% of the population cannot pay for it. So this has created a new type of class society. People are very, let's say, very angry with the de facto authorities for being so harsh and repressive and not paying salaries, but they see no alternative to that.
Thank you, Mr. Abdulghani. How is that from your perspective, Floor Beuming? You are currently stationed in the Netherlands. You are concerned with the region, not only Yemen itself, but also Saudi Arabia, Qatar. How do you look at the situation from here?
Well, Amnesty has been doing research in Yemen for many years, and especially since the war started in 2015, we've been looking into violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law in Yemen. And so our researchers have gone to Yemen several times to look into specific events, airstrikes that were indiscriminate, but also so airstrikes conducted by the Saudi-led coalition, yes, but also violations on the side of the Houthis and allied forces, violations in the south related to the UAE-backed forces. And so, yes, over the past years we've issued several reports describing what is happening, and we see that things have only gotten worse. So it's been very difficult to get access to Yemen, and increasingly so, especially to Houthi-controlled territory. So what we describe, what Amnesty publishes in terms of reports, is just a fraction of what is happening, because unfortunately there are not just human rights organizations have difficult access to Yemen, but also journalists. So it's incredibly difficult to get a complete picture of what's happening on the ground from here.
Can you really interfere from here with what might happen there, or is it more?
I mean, Amnesty's role is really, we are a watchdog organization, so we. The role that Amnesty has is reporting on what is happening, and so we use that information to lobby governments here, the Netherlands, the EU, but also and ask them, to for instance, put pressure on the Saudi-led coalition, on the Yemeni authorities, use their leverage, whatever leverage they have with the Houthi authorities, but also we use the information to raise the problem of arms transfer, because that's obviously one of the important roles that the Western states and companies have in this role, and also clear complicity in war crimes, basically, in Yemen. And I think in that way we have had influence. Yes. I mean, the Dutch government stopped selling arms. There are other governments that have stopped selling arms, but there are also very large countries that are still selling arms, like France, Germany, UK, and the US. The US recently, after Biden came to power, announced a freeze on arms transfer, but it's still quite unclear what that means in practice. And the fact is, unfortunately, that over the last 6 years, billions worth of weapons have already been sold to the Saudi-led coalition. So they are already armed to the teeth, unfortunately.
Let's go to arms and arms sales later. Let's start with the people of Yemen. 28 million inhabitants, of which 75 are dependent somehow on aid to survive. Humanitarian aid does not reach the country. Why is that, Floor? Is it a matter of geography, political, strategic?
No, well, there are different reasons for that. And Abdulghani, you can definitely add to this, because you know more on what's happening right now. But the problem has been that there is an aerial and naval blockade on Yemen. So the airport in Sana'a is closed for commercial flights. The harbor of Hodeida, one of the most important harbors in Yemen, has been largely destroyed, but also ships are not allowed to offload their goods there as fast as they need to. The Saudi coalition is using a UN resolution as an excuse to delay the offloading of supplies, fuel, medicine in Hodeida, so there's a delay there, which makes it very costly for ships to even bring their products. But once the ships have offloaded their goods, there's another problem, which is that the Houthis have basically weaponized aid as well. So they control where aid is going to for a large extent. There's incredible corruption. And so, the result is that the aid that does come into the country doesn't always reach the people that need it most.
So, Mr. Al-Iryani, the Houthis manage humanitarian aid, and they're getting stronger. What is the future perspective on getting aid to the people in Yemen?
Before I get to that, I'd like to add a couple of points to what Flora said.
Of course.
The legal basis for the blockade is very shaky. The UN the UN inspection mechanism issues certificates for vessels coming to the port of Hodeidah within 24 hours. And then the Saudis keep the vessels waiting for a month or two, or sometimes 3 months. All of this is due to corruption. Vessels have to pay a bribe to the representatives of the Yemeni government and the Saudi government to get in. There's no basis, no legal basis for that. As for the Sana'a airport, it's really curious, and I don't know how the UN could face the world with what it's doing. The UN has been organized VIP flights for Houthi leaders over the past few months, and yet the airport is closed to people who are sick and need life-saving treatment abroad. The UN, the Saudis, and the government of Yemen, the Houthis, are all conspiring against the people. And the closure of the airport of Sana'a is a collective punishment that does not affect those who are responsible for this situation. As far as access to assistance, the Houthis use the humanitarian assistance as a reward and sometimes as payment for families that are willing to send their kids to the front. So it is weaponized in a way that more than you can imagine. And I think that the international modality of intervention that they want to provide humanitarian assistance, they have to live with that. The way to counter that is by the UN moving from humanitarian response to early recovery, providing jobs and cash for work that would make it much harder for the Houthis to manipulate.
So that would be a possible breakthrough in this situation.
Yes, it could make a difference, but I'm afraid that as an ineffective bureaucracy,
Thank you, Mr. Al-Iryani. Floor, do you think there's a role for Amnesty maybe in these negotiations, in this breakthrough?
No. Amnesty doesn't get involved in such negotiations. What we do really is
too political.
produce the facts,
yes.
or show research, and then
maybe to the UN so they can force upon a breakthrough.
Yeah.
Mr. Al-Iryani, could you tell us something about the peace talks that are going on at the moment? Between who are those talks and whose interests weigh most heavily in this? Is there maybe an exit strategy possible? Yes, I think we lost connection. Are you with us, Mr. Al-Iryani? Yes.
But I think
I will ask you the same question, Floor. Yes, there you are, Mr. Al-Iryani from Sana'a. Could you tell us something about the negotiations and maybe peace talks that are going on at this moment? Between who are those talks?
The initial communication happened between the Houthis and the Saudis, and I think a Saudi-Houthi agreement is a prerequisite for national ceasefire, national cessation of hostilities. And then the UN envoy, along with the US Special Envoy that was appointed recently by the Biden administration, visited Muscat to meet with the Houthi delegation, yes. But the Houthis refused to meet the UN envoy, so the meetings were cancelled. The Houthis are on the advance in the front of Marib, eastern Yemen, and as long as they are advancing militarily, there will be no mood to talk about cessation of hostilities and peace talks.
So, what do you think? Well, could you elaborate on that?
I think what is so complicating about the conflict in Yemen is that there are so many different parties involved. And
it's a very tribal society.
Yeah, and it's not anymore the Houthis versus the government. And I mean, this conflict, we always say it started in 2015, but of course it goes back years before that. And it basically has to do with the control that the northern tribal military group has had over Yemen for years, and that's, you know, Yemen was there were two countries before 1990, right? You had the Yemen Arab Republic in the north, and you had the People's Democratic Republic in the south, which was a Marxist state. But there was always this idea, this strong Yemeni identity, and this idea of Yemeni unity was very important for people. And so in 1990, also for, you know, geopolitical reasons and the fall of the Soviet Union, these countries merged.
Yes.
But that merger was never a full integration of two countries. In the end, it became very clear very soon that the power of ruling, who was ruling the country, lied with a few people and their connections with specific tribes in the north. And so in the course of the years since unification, many different regions and groups in Yemen started feeling marginalized. Not just the Houthis in the north, but others as well. And you know, everything that has happened since it has to do with who controls resources, and are resources and is power equally shared in Yemen, and it's still not. And the Houthis have become a very powerful group now, demanding their share. But there are others as well. You have in the south now the Southern Transitional Council, representing Southerners that, would like to probably secede from Yemen and reestablish a southern state. And then there are all these other smaller groups as well. And
you have also Al-Qaeda, ISIS.
Yes, yeah. This political solution to the conflict is not just about finding a solution for the problems or the demands of the Houthis, but it's also taking into account the demands of all these other marginalized people. I don't know, Abdulghani, if you think the same, or
what role do you think that surrounding countries can play? But not only surrounding countries, also U.S., Russia, and maybe also Saudi Arabia and Iran. Mr. Abdulghani Al-Iryani, could you elaborate on that?
That's a very tricky question. On the one hand, my first instinct is to say, if we are left alone, maybe we'll be able to sort ourselves. But as Flor has explained, Yemen is now so fractured that we do need some kind of, let's say, support mechanism from the international community and from the region to prevent Yemen from falling apart and causing instability for the region for a long time, as the case in Somalia or Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So I think that one way of dealing with this is to have a larger group of countries that include countries that have no vested interest in Yemen, neutral countries, to serve as a guarantee mechanism for any discussions, negotiations, or agreements that Yemenis can reach in the future.
What countries are you thinking of?
Well, ideally, I'd like to have some North European countries, because they have no stake in the Yemeni conflict. For the Houthis to feel secure that they have a champion. Russia needs to be included.
Of course.
And of course, moderate countries from the region, such as Kuwait, Oman, and Jordan, could be helpful. Ethiopia, as an important neighbor of Yemen, could be helpful. You know, without positive, constructive engagement of the international and regional communities, I'm afraid Yemenis will not be able to restore their state.
Floor, you also work in Saudi Arabia, you work in Qatar. Do you see a role? Would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to add that I think another complicating factor is that the Saudi-led coalition also isn't really, their vision of the future of Yemen isn't the same. What the Emirates want, at least if you look at how they're, the practice of supporting groups in southern Yemen is also conflicting with what the Saudis want. And obviously these two parties are really important, have a strong influence on the outcome. The Emiratis have been supporting the Southern Transitional Council and related groups in the south, which are fighting also the government of Yemen that is being supported by the Saudis. But at the same time, they're in the same coalition. So I think as long as those two countries are have a different idea of what the future of Yemen would look like, I don't know if countries like of northern European countries can really push both sides to come to an agreement. How do you see that, Abdulghani, the role of the Emirates?
Of course, the Emirates and Saudi Arabia are at cross purposes in Yemen. I don't want to complicate this matter much, but Saudi Arabia has always had designs in Yemeni territory, and the Emirates does not agree with that for fear that as Saudi Arabia gets more powerful and gets larger, it will become even more hegemonic on all its neighbors, including the UAE. And therefore, they have, the Emiratis have made every effort to control the south and make Saudi Arabia unable to manipulate southern politicians so as to get a corridor to the Indian Ocean through the south.
Floor?
Yeah.
Yeah, you see. Like you said before, in January of this year, President Joe Biden, we are talking about other countries involved, President Joe Biden froze arms sales to Saudi Arabia and officially announced the end of American support for the Saudi coalition. You said that it's not quite...
It's not quite
sealed
clear
yet.
I think whether they, what falls under that, like whether new contracts are not signed or whether, basically completely all arms transfers are put on hold, and until when is that, is that used as a card basically to push the Saudis to. To be more constructive, or but I think it's definitely either way. It's an important signal.
There is an effect of this signal.
I mean, the Saudis a few weeks or months ago, in March, I think they announced that they wanted a peace agreement and that they wanted to have an agreement to stop at least the hostilities.
Yes.
So I think. Yeah, that definitely is. You cannot see that separate from the new administration in the U.S. But yeah, so far it hasn't led to any concrete step. So I don't know.
Mr. Al-Iryani, the U.S. has backed the Saudi-led offensive against the Houthis during both Obama and the Trump administrations. And like Floor said before, sold billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia since the war started. Do you see a different role for the U.S. under Joe Biden?
Yes, of course. To start with, when the Saudis decided to intervene in Yemen, the U.S. advised them not to, but had to provide them the support because they had already upset the Saudis at that time by progressing on the nuclear deal with Iran. So as some kind of compensation for the Saudis, the U.S. pledged to support their military campaign in Yemen. And then as soon as things began to go bad, the U.S. administration tried to stop the war, and Secretary Kerry made a proposal to end the war in the last weeks of the Obama administration, and but it was too late. Basically, the Saudis and the Americans said, "We'll just wait this one out," and then Trump came, who could refuse no request from the Saudis because he had other interests with them. Right now, the Saudis needed a wake-up call, as I call it, some kind of tough love from the U.S.
Yes.
to help them get out of the quagmire of Yemen and maintain their standing in the region. And the suspension of arms sales was the U.S.'s way of telling the Saudis, we are changing. We need something. We need to work differently. But it was only symbolic because the constraining factor of the Saudi military campaign in Yemen is spare parts for F-16s. If the U.S. wants to stop the Saudis from fighting, they can stop supplying them with spare parts for their jet fighters, and then the war will stop in 2 weeks.
But they're still sending those?
Yes, of course.
Yes. Floor?
Yeah, I mean, arms companies have an incredible role in this war, as you can.
In all wars.
In all wars,
all
but
the world, yes.
And I think also when it comes to not the solution for the conflict, but what is important in any conflict is accountability for violations.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's not just about the parties to the conflict that are responsible, but it's also the arms companies, and it's the states and the people that are approving the licenses for these arms sales. Therefore, it's interesting that Amnesty, but led actually by a Yemeni very important human rights organization called Muwatana for Human Rights, together with the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, they submitted a year and a half ago, I think, a big file to the International Criminal Court, to the prosecutor's office. Basically, I don't know, a 300-page document with evidence of airstrikes, mainly airstrikes on Yemen, that are illegitimate, that were disproportionate and indiscriminately targeting civilians.
Yes.
And linking those airstrikes to specific weapons sold to the Saudis and others involved in the airstrikes. With the question basically to the prosecutor, look into this and see if this evidence can be used to hold executives of those arms companies, as well as officials of governments that are approving those arms sales, if they can be held criminally responsible for those airstrikes. So those...
Has that happened?
I mean, no, this is a long process, and we don't know yet if that will actually happen. But that's also a very important signal to the arms companies, who are usually hiding behind the government, saying, well, you are approving the arms sales, and you are conducting your own risk assessment, and apparently you say it's safe enough to supply these arms.
So we're just...
So we are okay.
Yeah.
And what they are saying, and what Amnesty is saying, that no, you have as an individual, you are responsible as well, and you might be held to account in the future. So I think those kind of steps are really important, and I really hope that it scares those executives of those companies.
Do you see a role for Iran? How do you see the role of Iran? Maybe also the death of Soleimani make things worse?
Yeah, I think that's...
Maybe Mr. Al-Iryani? The role of Iran and the death of Soleimani by the US.
There is this tendency in the international community to exaggerate the Iranian role in the Yemeni conflict.
Okay.
The Saudis have been claiming from the beginning of the conflict in Saada in 2004 that Iran was behind it.
Yes.
And that's nonsense. Iran, of course, is supporting the Houthis, but there are real Yemeni dynamics and groups that are at conflict, as Flor explained earlier, over the power and wealth sharing. The Houthi movement is a strong indigenous movement that relies, of course, on technical support by Iran, but is quite capable of conducting the war by itself for a long time.
Okay. Thank you. We've discussed it before shortly. Yemen is a very tribal society divided into different tribes. The power of those tribes is big and inscrutable. Flor, when there are negotiations, how can one really get through to those different tribes and groups? Is that really possible?
I mean, Yemen is a tribal country, but not all of Yemen is. Some areas are have stronger tribal connections than others.
Yes.
Especially in the south, tribal affiliations has really disappeared in a lot of areas because of the history of colonization by the British, but also after that the period of the Marxist state. And in the south, yes, it's dominated by tribes, or it was, and now there are different tribes. But even there, you can't say that that all tribes have an equal share of power. And Yemen, I mean, the interesting thing about Yemen is that it's, that's also why the Saudis have always seen Yemen as a threat, is that it was a multi-party democracy, even though it wasn't functioning very well. But compared to other countries in the region, it was. There were many different political parties there, and the political parties also were not how do you say that, like tribal. They weren't based on tribal affiliations. You had the General People's Congress, that was the former president's party, was also a mix of different groups. You have Islah, the Islamist party, that is also a mix of different groups. You had the Yemeni Socialist Party, you had the Nasserite Party, you had really quite a wide range of political parties representing different interests in society. And I think that is still possible in the future, and so I don't think the solution to peace in Yemen is that it has to be a tribal-based, power-sharing arrangement. But what needs to be taken into account is that there are a lot of regions in Yemen that have been marginalized for decades, that didn't get their share of development and their share of the little bit of resources that Yemen has.
By the Yemeni government itself.
Yeah. So that's the people in the south, but also the people in the west, in the Tihama region, and the people in the north, in the Sada, Al Jawf, the more remote areas.
They need to be included.
They need to be
in
included.
This process, in this peace process.
Yeah, in governing their own country, everyone needs to be included.
Mr. Al-Iryani, Flor says that it's a multi-party country, different parties in one country, but all weakened. There seems to be a power vacuum. And it's also everyone against everyone. Flor says something about a possible solution. Do you have anything to add to that? Or maybe a different view on that? And this multi-party country working together?
Yeah, throughout history, Yemen was highly decentralized and was always based on some kind of national elite deal, where all groupings would be represented, and whenever that deal fails, then Yemen fractures into little princedoms and little entities. Yemen now is again decentralized in all the areas outside of the control of the Houthis. And that is creating a positive model in Marib in the east, Kalla in the south, and Aden to some extent. Therefore, I think that if we want to restore the Yemeni state, we have to reflect the facts on the ground that Yemen is now highly decentralized, and allow local communities to govern themselves, allow them to share power and wealth at the governorate level, and that way we will avoid the marginalization of any group, and we will prevent the dominance of one group over the others.
Stop marginalization, get them all included. Floor, you have lived in Yemen for 4 years. You studied the culture, you speak the language, you have daily contact with people in Yemen. But do you think it's really understandable for us here in the West to really understand what's going on there? It's such a complex situation and war.
Yeah. Yes.
When you talk to people here in the Netherlands, your friends, can you really explain what's going on in Yemen? Can we really understand?
I think, I mean, everyone should definitely try, and even myself, if you don't follow it for a while, you quickly lose the overview of all the different groups that are involved and the new affiliations. That previously enemies are suddenly friends, and but I think people are. There are so many conflicts in the region, obviously, and in the world that it's hard to keep track. But I think the difficulty with Yemen is that we don't have a large influx of Yemeni refugees coming to our countries with stories.
Like in Syria?
Like in Syria, yeah. Like you have so many Syrians that are, interviewed here in the media that tell their
Why is
tell their stories.
We don't have that influx of
that's
refugees?
Because Yemen is so incredibly isolated and far away, and it's at the tip of the peninsula, surrounded by Saudi in the north and Oman in the east, and it's it's almost impossible for Yemenis to cross the border to Saudi, and so if they want to leave the country, they have to cross the sea to the Horn of Africa, where there are also conflicts.
Somalia, Ethiopia.
Yeah, and there are still actually refugees coming from that side to Yemen. So it's really not an easy choice to make for Yemenis to cross the sea. And if they do, they have to travel all the way, up through Egypt or Libya to the sea, cross with a boat. We know the stories. Obviously, it's a horrific journey. So not many people probably dare to take that risk. So most of the refugees, or most of the people fleeing the conflict in Yemen, are internally displaced people, having moved within Yemen to a safer place. And so I think that really makes a difference. We don't hear the personal stories of people.
We don't see them.
We don't see them, and it's still, like I said earlier, it's really difficult for journalists to access Yemen, and that's why actually it's a colleague of Abdulghani who from the Sana Center for Strategic Studies, who has done a lot of really great work in organizing visits of journalists to Yemen. So he has gathered, this is Farah al-Muslimi, he's gathered journalists from big newspapers all around the world.
Even now that's possible.
Yeah, and he organized, and he is able to guarantee their safety. And of course, depending on where they go, they are always a bit limited in their, their freedom of movement and who they want to talk to. But even within those restrictions, I think those visits have been really valuable and have really led to a lot of coverage of what is happening. So that's important. And then aside from the media and ordinary citizens telling their stories, it's important that organizations like Amnesty, but also local human rights organizations like Muwatana, are able to carry out their work freely and investigate violations and report on them, and then travel abroad also to tell the world about them.
You've been there recently?
No, I haven't. No, I have. The last time I was there was in 2013.
Before the war.
Before the war, yeah. And but
Beautiful images we see. It's from a Dutch artist.
From that time?
Yes, from that time, before the war. Yes, shot there.
But my colleagues who conduct the research in Yemen, they have been more recently. But even that, I think the last time they were able to go was in 2019. So, and then even then they were not allowed to go to Houthi-controlled territory. So they, yeah.
Mr. Al-Iryani, do you see many journalists, people from NGOs, from other countries visiting Yemen to get a perspective on the situation there?
It's getting harder and harder.
Yes.
And I'm speaking from Sana'a, so I can tell you what's happening here.
Yes, of course.
The de facto authorities of the Houthis are making life more and more miserable, not just for journalists, but even for humanitarian workers. They exercise excessive controls, and the Yemeni workers, Yemeni employees of international humanitarian agencies are often arrested or kidnapped. It's really difficult. It's their policy to control and then maybe eliminate external presence in Yemen because of their worldview, the outside is a natural enemy.
Yeah, and it's not just international workers or journalists. It's also the Houthis have targeted national journalists in Sana'a heavily, arrested many journalists on charges of spying for the Saudis and charged them for terrorism-related courts, sentenced them to death. So, you know, they're really restricting freedom of expression in Houthi-controlled areas as well. So, yeah, that really shows how incredibly difficult it is to get a good picture of what's happening. Yeah.
And do you think that's one of the reasons that we hear so little about the situation in Yemen here in the West? You
Yes.
sketched it out. It's far away. We don't see the people from Yemen here in the West. Working there as a journalist is almost impossible. People get kidnapped.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's the reason.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Mr. Al-Iryani?
No, I think that's it.
That's it. Well, then I want to say a big thank you to both of you for participating in this conversation about Yemen. And I really hope for a breakthrough in the short term for the people in Yemen. Well, thank you very much for watching. This was the second episode of the new Bali series, Deep Talks. Thank you for watching, and check our website for more information on future episodes. Thank you.